Hey, good evening, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Post Daily Dose with me, your trusted parenting advisor, faithful guide, and servant on the healing journey. What's my name? Big Papa Brian+Post. In this episode, we are going to talk about raising your child genius. Did you know you had a genius? You probably didn't, and that is a sad, sad thing because professionals and teachers have not helped you to see your child that way. But let me ask you a question. What do Steve Jobs, Jeff Bezos, and most likely your child all have in common? They're either have all experienced early life trauma or they're adopted. Did you know that? So there was an author of a book, and you can get this book on Amazon. It's called Flow. And in fact, before I say that, let me say that, I'm just kind of excited to jump right into this topic tonight. Let me say that I just posted in the Post+Institute Facebook page the link to my interview that I did with author Susan Kachinskas, author of Chemistry of Connection, Susan Kachinskas. So I did an interview with her, and I mentioned this on the Post Daily Dose a couple episodes back. Maybe even mentioned it last night. I can't remember. But she had interviewed me, and I had shared some information with her. And then this book came out, and then she sent me the book, and I was reading the book, and I thought, hey, I want to interview you now for the Inner Circle. And then I'm interviewing her. I had read through the book. But then I was interviewing her and literally, hey, good evening, Laura, and hi, Mom. And I was interviewing her, and oh my gosh, she started talking about oxytocin and it being the brain's anti-stress hormone. And I swear, you will hear the light bulbs going off. And it's like this little buzzing sound when it happens. Bzzz, and they're going off in my head. So go to the Post+Institute Facebook page after the Daily Dose, of course, and you'll see the link and listen to it. And if you love it, which I think you will, you should probably go pick up the book. And I gave you a link to the Amazon to get the book as well. And then Susan and I actually followed up later and wrote a book together called Oxytocin Parenting. And so that's available somewhere on there too. Once you click on, I didn't even look, didn't have time. I was just getting the link for you guys. But once you get a chance to look at that, maybe you'll find that one too. It's somewhere in there, and maybe an ebook. Can't remember. So anyway, check that out. And then I also promised you the interview with Dr. Stephen Gafanti, who talked about kinesthetic learning, which kind of ties in to tonight's episode, and also what had me thinking. And I talked about him last night, and what had me thinking about this morning. So Christy is working on pulling that from the archives for you as well, and then we'll get that posted so you can enjoy that also. So Jeff Bezos, Steve Jobs, both adopted, which means, your child could be biological, could be adopted child, could be a foster child. But what I'm going to guarantee you is that if you're showing up here on the Post Daily Dose, you probably have a child with some behavior challenges, and lots of our posties have children who've been adopted and have children who are in foster care. So that tells me you've got a child who's experienced early life trauma. And the process of adoption, the process of losing one parent, one biological parent, that is a trauma. And it is oftentimes, I've said this before, it is oftentimes an irreparable trauma that will kind of travel with us through life. And it's well documented kind of the challenges that both Steve Jobs and Jeff Bezos have had in their interpersonal emotional relationships, is what I want to say. And that is a byproduct of early trauma exposure. But here's what I want you to know that you probably didn't know. So there's an author of a book called Flow. And so since you're already going to go to Amazon and get Chemistry of Connection, you should check out this book, Flow. Is a Russian researcher. His name is in the book. It's I think it's like Mikhail, but it's Mikhail Mixetchikai. It's a weird name. So check that out too. But it's Flow, Flow. And I don't know. I got that book buried somewhere, but it is fantastic. But here's what I want you to hear. He says in the book, if you want to create a genius, you should emotionally neglect the child. Is that not interesting? he's not saying that we should emotionally neglect children. He is saying that the outcome, the byproduct of emotional neglect is genius, because what the right hemisphere does not get, the left hemisphere compensates for. So it's like when the emotional brain is neglected because of a diminished social emotional interactions, diminished social emotional activity, diminished oxytocin relationships in the environment, in the nurturing environment, the left hemisphere actually overcompensates that. And as it overcompensates, it becomes hyperdeveloped. Therefore, you have a child who is more hypervigilant. You have a child who obviously learns differently, but they're much more cognitively oriented. And the problem that you encounter is that even though they are cognitively overdeveloped in their left hemisphere is still directed from their right hemisphere. So the immature emotional brain still dictates to the overmature cognitive rationalizing thinking brain. And so then what happens is you've got this child who, when they become really stressed out, they can obsess, they can become really defensive, they can become really what's rigid. That's not the word I'm looking for, but they can become almost pig-headed, like so determined. It's like they get locked in to a way of thinking and they can't see anything different. This is very common with children who are on the autism spectrum. So they get locked into one way of thinking. That is a byproduct of trauma. See, the emotional brain is fueling that overdeveloped cognitive rational brain, but it can't, the child is not equipped. They're not equipped to be able to regulate that part of their brain. So stress causes them to get completely overwhelmed and irrational. But here's the thing, and here's the beauty of this, and I really want you to see this, because so many times we think about our children who've had early life traumas and early painful experiences and who now have these behavior issues. We see them as being somewhat deviant to society because they don't fit within, the norms and the socially accepted things. In fact, Steve Jobs wrote a little quote. It's here's to the crazy ones, the ones who don't fit within the social norms, the rule breakers and the rebels. So he's famous for that little quote. I'll have to get that for you, and it's really pretty cool. But the thing is your child doesn't fit within these norms, and so society labels them as delinquent and deviant because we've got all these cultural beliefs of how children should act. And the problem is that everything around them in the greater environment is about reinforcing that they should act a certain way, that they should behave this certain way, even in schools, especially in schools. Schools all have desks in a line. Right? They all have lockers in a line, and some schools have uniforms, so all the children look the same. Well, schools came about in the agriculture and then the industrial age, so that children could learn to be good workers. That's really what the whole premise of school was for. The organized school as we know it now was for educating children so when they got old enough they could be good workers in factories. And that, that's the industrial age. And that no longer fits the brains of our children today. It really doesn't even fit the brains of our children who haven't experienced trauma. But we have these belief systems that encompass our children, and they constantly feel like failures because they don't fit in to what we have come to believe is socially acceptable. They are not socially acceptable, and it's great that they're not. I mean, it's great that, I have always been a rule breaker. I've always had problems with authority. And in fact, I learned very early in my career as a social worker, when I got my master's degree, I had, and this was when I was between the ages of 23 and 24, I had 4 or 5 different jobs, social work roles, social work positions within about a 6-month period of time. And then I ended up with a master's degree working at a temp agency, pushing patients at Harris Methodist Hospital in Fort Worth. And one day I realized, and this is the first time I had this realization, I'm like, dang, Brian, you've got problems with authority, dude. I've always had problems with authority. And I don't suffer fools lightly. And a lot of times people who are in positions of authority, they don't question the status quo. They don't question the way things have always been. And so I remember one of my final social work jobs during that time was at a Lena Pope treatment home in Fort Worth. And quite frankly, my supervisor she was like a factory worker. She just knew, she had the degree. She just knew to show up and make sure everyone dotted their I's and crossed their T's. And here I come fresh out of graduate school. I've got my little dreadlocks, my little earrings, my little Doc Marten sandals, and I'm just on fire about, families feeling good with one another and us being loving human beings. And I'm working with these kids in home in Fort Worth in this poverty area. And these were juvenile delinquent children. And so this might have been my whole life for the most part. So I'm working with these kids, and I remember one day these parents, I had been working with this young man, and these parents kind of laughed about the fact that the dad, who was this truck driver who came in on the weekends, would handcuff this kid to the bed. And I had the most overwhelming emotional reaction, because this young man, had been diagnosed oppositional defiant and was acting out. And he's a little kid. His name was David. Still remember him. And his dad was a big old ugly truck driver. And his mom was just this kind of angry, fiery woman. And I had an emotional reaction, and I just said, that is not okay. And I was there with another social worker at that time, and I couldn't contain myself. Like, I had to leave. I was like, that's not okay. And I left. And later, the therapist that was with me reported me and said that I had stormed out of the house, which I really had, but I apparently, when I went out the door, I hit the dangling lock on the door, and it made a little, kind of dangled around, and so it really kind of made it a little more dramatic of a exit than it really was. I just left. I was pissed. I just did not feel it was okay for these parents to be locking this young man, to handcuffing this young man to his bed, and he was 12 years old. And then to have another social worker right there beside me who did not seem to have an issue with it. And so my rabble-rousing ways go way back. But my point of telling you that is that I learned really early that I had problems with authority figures, and that I was probably going to have to either be self-employed and do my own thing, or I was going to have a job that gave me a lot of flexibility. Well, I found that position eventually, which then led to me starting my own clinic when I was 25. So it was within a year that I opened my first mental health clinic in Ardmore, Oklahoma. It's called the Child and Family Guidance Center. And so, I haven't worked for anyone since then. So that's, we're talking 20 years now, because I learned really early in life that I need to do my own thing. And so many of your children, these are children with genius levels of ability. The problem is that our culture and our structures of environment and education do not support their genius. So what are the things that they are genius in? And this is really important for you to really look at. And I remember my sister was the same way. She was a genius in mechanical engineering. She had an engineering brain. I mean, she could work on stuff. She started tearing stuff up when she was early, and when she was young. And we look at this, in a family, and like, you're always tearing stuff up. And she would tear stuff up. She'd get a toy, and in no time flat, the Barbie doll heads would be pulled off, the arms would be pulled off. And mom and dad would get mad at her because they thought she was just tearing up stuff. But she had a curious brain. Her brain worked in a mechanical way. And as she got older, that was actually a common a common denominator with her and my father is that they could actually go outside and get under the hood and work on a freaking car together. That was a source of bonding for them. Well, no one understood that she had that kind of brain. So no one really helped foster that ability for her, but she probably could have gone on and become an engineer. She could have gone on and probably owned her own auto body shop or mechanic shop or any number of things, any number of possibilities. But the thing is, and I really do believe that there's something with the trauma brain that lends itself to kinesthetic type learning. So children who have trauma, and I want you to think about this because it's important to identify your child's dominant learning style. Are they visual? Are they auditory? Are they kinesthetic? Do they learn through looking at stuff? Do they learn through hearing? Or do they learn through movement? See, I'm primarily a visual learner. It is useful for me to see, but I like the reinforcement of the hearing. I'm not real big on kinesthetic, moving around and learning that way. I need to see it and I need to hear it. So a lot of times I layer my learning, and I learned to do this in school. I would read and I would record myself while reading, so I get the visual of reading and looking, but then I'm also recording myself so I could play it back and hear it, and it just compounds my learning. So your dominant learning style for your child is really important. And how can you foster that? Start fostering that strength now, because school is going to focus on weaknesses, and that's a big problem. Screw the weaknesses, right? Don't forget about the weaknesses. Don't worry about the weaknesses. In school, in traditional education, we want to focus on the weaknesses to try to bring them up to match the strengths. But there's a reason they're a weakness. They're a weakness because they are not the strength. Instead of focusing on the strength, and the strength eventually compensating for the weakness. So when you become Steve Jobs and you have many, many, many resources, you have enough strengths because of your strengths. You have enough resources to deal with your weaknesses. You can hire people to deal with the weaknesses. When you're Jeff Bezos, you have enough resources, enough strength to have people deal with the weaknesses. So we want to focus on our children's weaknesses, and it just beats down their self-esteem. It beats down their confidence. And what it does is it diminishes their genius. How many times have you met children how many times have you met adults who now are kind of wayward, but are smart and really intelligent? I know I have met so many. They're adults who function on this genius level, but now they've gone through society and they have really low self-esteem, and they usually isolate themselves. And, they usually don't work jobs that really maximize their capabilities. I mean, my nephew is a prime example right now. This kid's a freaking genius. He's autistic. And so if you left to his own devices, he would just isolate in his room and be on the computer all day. He'd never get a job, and he'd never worry about it because it's not within his routine. But when you talk to him, the kid is at a genius level, but we have to work with him just to get him to start working in a job so he can start learning how to just go through those routines. He's 21 years old now. Go through those routines and get used to interacting in society so that we can get him to the place that we can eventually start directing him in his strengths. But he's got a $10 an hour, assembly line job right now, which I swear to God, he would do that job he is that kid. He's that guy that in 30 years, he's got this higher level, supervisory position in this factory because he's been there for 30 years. And he does the same thing over and over and over and over and over again. It's because that's how his brain operates. It's in a routine, but that's not his strength. His strength is so much bigger than that. So I want to encourage you, instead of looking at your child's weaknesses, because that's the easiest thing to do, I want to encourage you to consider that you have a genius in your midst if you can just dig around and investigate enough and find out what that is. And when you find out what that is, you start thinking about, go ahead and send your kid to school. That's fine. I'm not saying, sometimes, my daughter, my 15-year-old's been homeschooled for a long time. She's got genius. She's painting now, and she's got musical genius, and she's just amazing. But she just didn't public school didn't work for her, and we were fortunate enough to be able to have her be able to be homeschooled. So that's not always an option for every family, for every child. If it is, you should really consider it. And I have advocated for children to be homeschooled, but not just homeschooled in a traditional way, but homeschooled in a way that says, hey, teach them their fundamentals and then connect them with a mentor who's got a mechanic shop that they can go start working for, or who works on airplanes and they can go start, giving them wrenches, or someone who works on a farm and they can go start working with the farmer. Get them in their genius, get them in the path to maximize their genius is what I'm telling you. Because going through school and going through all the crap they got to deal with in school is not maximizing their genius. And then because it's not maximizing their genius, they have challenges. Because they are not being fulfilled, they're not being stimulated at a level that means something to them. So I want you to think about that, because I think that you'd be really surprised. I have had the good fortune and the honor to spend time with a lot of child geniuses, and some find their way and are able to excel and move in that direction, and others continue to struggle. So remember, in any situation, in any experience, we all have two choices. We can continue to react from our same imprints of stress and fear and overwhelm, or we can stop. We can take 3 to 10 deep breaths. We can slow down, and we can choose love. I hope you will lay down tonight. I hope the stress from your body will dissipate. I hope you will wake up tomorrow morning refreshed, excited, inspired, and ready to conquer the day and be the amazing super parent that you are. You wouldn't be here right now, right here today, if you weren't an amazing parent. You wouldn't have the children you have right now if you weren't the parent for them. You are the parent for them. You are everything that they need. You are everything that is going to be required to take them to where they need to be. You're just a few breaths, you're one breath away from a breakthrough in your parenting. Just one breath away to the breakthrough and to the peace and the love and the joy that you're seeking in your home. God bless you, and we'll see you tomorrow.